The bullet shattered the schoolhouse window just as Miss Emma Hawkins finished writing arithmetic on the blackboard. Her chalk clattered to the floor as 20 children froze in their seats, morning sunlight streaming through the fresh hole. "In the glass, under your desks," she ordered calmly, though her heart raced. Outside, a black-clad rider disappeared into the tree line, leaving only dust and silence behind. When she opened the door, a note waited, nailed, crude, and threatening. "Leave Timber Creek by sundown, Miss Hawkins, or next time we won't miss. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." 6 months earlier, Emma Hawkins had stepped down from the westbound stagecoach into the dust of Timber Creek's main street, her carpet bag clutched tight and her letter of appointment from the territorial Governor Crisp in her pocket. The autumn wind had whipped at her neat traveling dress, carrying with it the mingled scents of wood smoke, horse, and sage. The town had regarded her with suspicious eyes. Women were scarce enough on the frontier, but an educated Eastern lady aiming to teach. Their children seemed to strike the townsfolk as something between a curiosity and an affront. Through the grimy windows of the Golden Nugget Saloon, weather-beaten faces had watched her progress down the street, muttering into their whiskey glasses about fancy ideas and wasted money. Mayor Whitaker had met her on the steps of the town hall, mopping his bald pate with a yellowed handkerchief. "Now, Miss Hawkins," he'd blustered, "you must understand that Timber Creek ain't much for book learning. Our folks need their young'uns for the farms and ranches. Reading and such, well, it's a mite impractical out here." But Emma had stood her ground, her green eyes flashing with the same determination that had carried her 2,000 miles west. "Mr. Mayor, I've come to teach, and teach I shall. Every child deserves the gift of letters, whether they're destined for the ranch or greater things." The schoolhouse they'd given her had been little more than an abandoned storage shed, dirt floor, broken windows, and a roof that leaked when it rained. But Emma had seen possibility in those bare walls. With help from Tom Bennett, the town's young doctor who'd taken an immediate interest in both her mission and her company, she'd transformed the space. Fresh whitewash brightened the walls, new glass panes kept out the wind, and solid planks replaced the dirt floor. Word spread slowly at first. Sarah Cooper was her first student, brought by a mother who'd never learned to write her own name and dreamed of better for her daughter. Then came the Watson boys, 3 tow-headed brothers, whose father figured reading might help them with cattle contracts someday. By Christmas, 12 students filled her benches, their eager faces turned up to her like flowers to the sun. Emma taught them more than just their letters. She brought stories of far-off places, tales of great deeds and greater dreams. She taught them songs from back east, their young voices rising pure and clear in the frontier morning. And slowly, the town's resistance began to crack. Even old Jake Murphy, who'd been the loudest voice against fancy schooling, changed his tune the day his grandson Tommy proudly read aloud from the family Bible at Sunday service. The boy's clear voice, carrying the ancient words to every corner of the small church, had brought tears to the old rancher's eyes. But Emma kept one secret close to her heart. When she'd signed her name in the town register, she'd carefully omitted any mention of her brother, the infamous Marshal Jake Hawkins. His reputation as the deadliest lawman in the territories would have preceded her, colored every interaction, every friendship she hoped to build. She'd come west to teach, to bring light and learning to this rough corner of the world, not to live in the shadow of her brother's gun. Besides, she told herself as she watched her growing brood of students practice their sums, Timber Creek was too small, too remote to attract the kind of trouble that required a marshal's attention. Here she could simply be Miss Emma, the schoolmarm who brought letters to the frontier. If only she'd known how wrong she was. The photograph lay face down in Emma's desk drawer, hidden beneath a stack of unmarked composition books. Some nights, when the prairie wind howled lonely against her boarding house windows, she'd take it out and trace the stern faces captured. In the silver nitrate image, her brother Jake stood rigid in his marshal's coat, star glinting on his chest, eyes hard as gunmetal. Beside him, a younger Emma smiled tentatively, still wearing the black of mourning for their parents. 10 years had passed since that day in Denver, when Jake had pinned on his badge and sworn to bring law to the lawless territories. 10 years of tracking men through wilderness, of shootouts in dusty streets, of bringing back outlaws dead or alive, mostly dead. The papers called him Hawkins the Hunter, and mothers frightened naughty children with tales of his relentless pursuit of evildoers. Emma had watched her gentle older brother transform into something hard and dangerous, like winter frost crystallizing clear water into deadly ice. Even now, letters arrived occasionally from far-flung towns, bearing news of his latest exploits. She left them unopened more often than not. "A penny for your thoughts, Miss Hawkins." Dr. Bennett's voice startled her from her reverie. She looked up to find him leaning in her schoolhouse doorway, his medical bag in hand and a warm smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. Though younger than most frontier doctors, Thomas Bennett had quickly earned the town's trust with his skilled hands and compassionate manner. "Just wool gathering, doctor," she replied, hastily tucking the photograph away, making lesson plans for next week. He crossed to her desk, his boots quiet on the wooden floor. "You work too hard. Perhaps you'd allow me to escort you to the social." On Saturday, Mrs. Murphy's promised her famous apple pie. Emma felt warmth rise in her cheeks. The doctor had been calling regularly these past months, finding excuses to check on the children's health or discuss town matters. His quiet courtship, conducted with proper frontier decorum, had become the subject of considerable speculation among Timber Creek's womenfolk. "I'd be delighted," she said, then added with a small smile, "assuming you're not called away to deliver any babies. I've spoken firmly to all the expectant mothers in town. They've agreed to accommodate my social calendar." His eyes twinkled with humor, but there was something else there too, a shadow that flickered across his face like a cloud passing over the sun. Before she could puzzle it out, hoofbeats thundered past the schoolhouse. A rider pulled up hard. At the telegraph office, kicking up dust. Through the window, Emma saw young Billy Watson, who worked at his uncle's ranch 20 miles north, practically fall from his horse in his haste. "Trouble?" she asked, noting how the doctor's hand had moved unconsciously to the pocket where, she knew, he kept a small derringer. "Probably just news about the spring cattle drive," Bennett said, but his tone lacked conviction. "Though there have been rumors." "What kind of rumors?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "The Mason gang's been spotted in the territory. They've hit 3 towns in the past month. Banks, mostly, but they're not known for their restraint." Emma's blood ran cold. The Mason gang, led by the infamous Mason brothers, had carved a bloody trail across 4 territories. Their raids left more than empty bank vaults behind. They left widows, orphans, and burned out buildings as their signature. "Surely they wouldn't come to Timber Creek," she said. "We're hardly worth their attention." Bennett's face was grave. "Money's not. All they're after, from what I hear. They enjoy the terror they create, the power it gives them over ordinary folks." A child's laugh echoed from outside. Little Sarah Cooper chasing her friend Mary Watson past the schoolhouse. Emma watched them play, these innocent children she'd grown to love as her own, and felt fear settle like a stone in her stomach. "If they do come," Bennett said softly, reading her thoughts, "this town will need people of strength and principle to stand against them. People like you, Miss Hawkins." She met his earnest gaze, wondering what he'd say if he knew about Jake, about the heritage of violence that ran in her blood. Would he still look at her with such admiration if he knew his gentle schoolmarm was sister to the most feared lawman in the West? "I'm just a teacher," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. She was a Hawkins, and Hawkins didn't run from trouble. They faced it, for better or worse. The shadow she'd glimpsed earlier passed across Bennett's face again. He opened his mouth as if to say more, then thought better of it. "Saturday, then?" he asked instead. "Saturday," she confirmed, watching him go, unable to shake the feeling that storm clouds were gathering on Timber Creek's horizon. The Mason gang announced their arrival in Timber Creek on a Wednesday afternoon, when the spring mud had just begun to dry on the streets. They rode in slow, 5 hard men on dark horses, their gun belts worn low and their eyes shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. The town seemed to hold its breath as they passed, shopkeepers retreating behind their doors, mothers hurrying children inside. Emma was teaching multiplication tables when she heard the hoofbeats. She kept her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she wrote numbers on the blackboard. Through the window, she watched the riders pass, their horses' heads bobbing like dark omens. The leader, Clay Mason himself, rode a coal-black stallion. Unlike his dust-covered men, he wore a clean black coat and a silver-trimmed hat. His face might have been handsome once, before whatever darkness had twisted it into its current state. As if sensing her gaze, he turned in his saddle, eyes meeting hers through the schoolhouse window. His smile made her blood run cold. "Class dismissed," she said quietly, though it was an hour early. "Straight home, children. No dawdling today." They knew better than to argue. Even the youngest could sense the change in the air, like the pressure drop before a storm. As they filed out, Emma stood in the doorway, counting each small head until all was safely away. The riders had stopped at the saloon, their horses hitched outside like harbingers of doom. Already whispers were spreading through town about who they were, what they might want. Emma heard fragments as parents collected their children. Mason brothers. 3 banks robbed in Montana. Killed the sheriff in Copper Creek. No law here to stop them. Mayor Whitaker scurried past the schoolhouse, his round face pale and sweating despite the cool spring air. He paused when he saw Emma, wringing his hands. "Miss Hawkins, perhaps it would be best if there were no school tomorrow. Just until our visitors move on." Emma straightened her spine. "These children need their education, Mr. Mayor. I won't have their learning interrupted by the presence of a few rough men." "These ain't just rough men," he hissed, glancing nervously toward the saloon. "These are the Mason brothers and their gang. They've killed dozens, burned whole towns that stood against them. We ain't got the means to fight such men." A burst of raucous laughter erupted from the saloon, making them both jump. Through the swinging doors, Emma caught glimpses of the gang. Boots on tables, guns displayed openly, whiskey flowing freely. Clay Mason sat apart from his men, watching the town through the window with the calculating eyes of a wolf sizing up. A flock of sheep. "Then perhaps," Emma said quietly, "it's time Timber Creek found those means." The mayor stared at her as if she'd gone mad. "Miss Hawkins, please. Don't go getting any foolish ideas. Just keep your head down. They'll move on once they've had their fun." But Emma had seen the way Clay Mason looked at the town, not as a temporary stop, but as a potential conquest. These men wouldn't simply move on. They'd stay, taking what they wanted until someone stood against them. As if summoned by her thoughts, Dr. Bennett appeared at her side. "Emma," he said softly, using her given name for the first time. "May I walk you home? These streets aren't safe right now." She noticed he wore his coat despite the warm afternoon, the bulk of a revolver visible beneath it. Their eyes met, and she saw her own concerns mirrored in his face. Something was coming to Timber Creek, something that would test them all. "Thank you, Dr. Bennett," she said, taking his offered arm. As they walked, she could feel Clay Mason's eyes following them from the saloon window. The shadow of violence had fallen across their small town, and Emma feared it would take more than a doctor's pistol or a schoolmarm's courage to drive it back. She thought of the photograph in her desk, of her brother's stern face and steady gun hand. For the first time in years, she wondered if perhaps Timber Creek might need more than just letters and learning to survive what lay ahead. The town hall's oil lamps cast flickering shadows across worried faces as Timber Creek citizens gathered for the hastily called meeting. 3 days had passed since the Mason gang's arrival, 3 days of increasing tension as the Outlaws made themselves at home in their town. Emma sat between Dr. Bennett and Sarah Cooper's mother, her back straight as a ruler despite her exhaustion. She hadn't slept well, the sound of drunken shooting and shouting from the saloon keeping her awake into the small hours. Clay Mason stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding attention even without his gun belt. His 4 men lounged against the walls, hands never far from their weapons. The gang leader's voice was surprisingly cultured as he addressed the assembled townspeople. "Good people of Timber Creek," he said, smiling like a wolf in a henhouse, "we're simple men with simple needs. Consider us your new protective service. $20 a month from each business, 10 from each household, and we'll ensure nothing unfortunate happens to your fine establishment." "That's robbery!" Old Jake Murphy's voice cracked through the stunned silence. "We're honest folk here. We don't need your kind of protection." Mason's smile didn't waver, but his eyes turned cold. "Mr. Murphy, isn't it? Owner of the largest cattle spread hereabouts?" He walked slowly toward the old rancher. "Be a shame if rustlers hit your herd, or if fire took your barn. Accidents happen so easily out here on the frontier." Emma watched the color drain from faces around the room. These people, her neighbors, her students' parents, were about to submit to tyranny out of fear. She couldn't blame them. They had families to protect, livelihoods to preserve. But then little Tommy Murphy, who just last week had proudly spelled responsibility correctly, tugged at his grandfather's sleeve. "Grandpa," he whispered loud enough to carry in the quiet room, "you said we don't bow to bullies." Emma stood before she could stop herself. "Mr. Mason," her voice rang clear despite her pounding heart, "this is a law-abiding town. We have no need of your services." Mason turned to her, that terrible smile still playing on his lips. "Ah, the schoolmarm. Miss Hawkins, isn't it? You know, I've been watching your little classroom. Fine work you're doing, teaching these children their letters." He took a step toward her. "But perhaps you're teaching them too much, getting above their station, filling their heads with ideas." "Education isn't a station, Mr. Mason," she replied steadily. "It's a right, just like the right to live without fear in one's own town." One of Mason's men snickered. "Ain't you a spitfire, schoolmarm? Boss, maybe we ought to teach her some respect." "Now see here." Dr. Bennett started to rise, but Emma laid a warning hand on his arm. This wasn't the time for violence, not yet. Mason raised an eyebrow at the doctor's reaction, something calculating passing behind his eyes. "First payment's due Friday," he announced to the room. "Anyone thinking of sending for the law should remember marshals can't protect everyone at once, but we'll be here day and night, watching." As the townspeople filed out, Emma felt the weight of Mason's stare. She'd made herself a target. She knew, but watching Tommy Murphy walk tall beside his grandfather, she couldn't regret it. "That was brave," Dr. Bennett said softly as they left the hall. "And foolish." "Sometimes they're the same thing," she replied. Then, making a decision that had been building since the gang's arrival, she added, "I need to send a telegram." "Emma, no, if they catch anyone trying to contact a marshal," she cut him off. "My brother, he's a lawman, the best I know." The admission cost her something, saying it aloud after keeping it secret so long. "He can help." Bennett's face went through a complex series of emotions before settling into grim determination. "I'll create a distraction tomorrow. Get their attention away from the telegraph office." He hesitated. "Your brother. He's not just any lawman. Is he? He's Jake Hawkins. Emma stared at him in surprise. How did you— I have some experience with law enforcement, he said carefully. Everyone knows the Hawkins name. He glanced back at the town hall, where Mason and his men were emerging. God help us all when he arrives. Dawn hadn't yet touched the eastern sky when Emma slipped through Timber Creek's empty streets. Her dark shawl wrapped tight against the pre-morning chill, she moved like a shadow between buildings, her heart thundering with each crunch of gravel. Beneath her boots, the telegraph office occupied a narrow space between the general store and the bank. Old Mr. Phillips, the operator, lived above his office, and Emma prayed he'd remember their arrangement from yesterday's whispered conversation after church. A horse nickered from the direction of the saloon. Emma froze, pressing herself against a wall. 2 of Mason's men had taken to patrolling at night, enforcing their own brand of order. Through the gloom, she could make out their silhouettes moving down the far end of the street. The telegraph office's back door opened at her soft knock. Phillips, dressed in his nightshirt with a coat hastily thrown over, ushered her inside. "Quick now," he whispered. "They've been watching the office." "Did you send my first message yesterday?" Emma asked, following him to the telegraph key. "Aye, but got no response." Philip's fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted the machine. "Miss Hawkins, if they catch us—" "They won't," she assured him, though her own confidence felt hollow. "Just one more message, please." The old man nodded, positioning his fingers over the key. Emma retrieved a carefully folded paper from her pocket, smoothing it in the dim lamplight. "Urgent. Stop. Jake need you. Timber Creek. Stop Mason gang here. Stop children in danger. Stop your sister. Stop." The tap-tap-tap of the key seemed deafening in the pre-dawn quiet. Emma held her breath with each pause, certain the sound would bring Mason's men running. But only silence followed. "Now we wait," Philip said, wiping nervous sweat from his brow. "Though whether Marshal Hawkins is even in range of a telegraph station—" A floorboard creaked upstairs. Both froze. Then came the unmistakable sound of boots on the office's front steps. "Back door," Phillips mouthed, gesturing urgently. Emma slipped out just as voices approached the front door. She caught fragments of conversation, checking all messages. "Boss wants to know if anyone's called for help." She ran on silent feet through the alley, not stopping until she reached the schoolhouse. Only then did she realize she was clutching a response message Phillips had pressed into her hand during their hasty parting. Under the weak light of her lamp, she read the reply that had apparently come yesterday. Message received. Stop, hold firm, stop riding hard, stop Jake, stop relief. Ward with fresh anxiety in her chest. Jake was coming. But what would happen when he arrived? Her brother's methods of justice tended to leave blood and brass scattered in the street. The school day brought new worries. 3 empty seats marked the absence of the Murphy children. Old Jake Murphy's defiance at the meeting had earned him a midnight visit from the gang. His barn now lay in ashes, and his grandchildren were being kept home for their safety. Dr. Bennett arrived at lunch, his face grave. "They're going through the telegraph records," he reported quietly, sharing half his sandwich with her as had become their custom. "Phillips is holding firm, but—" "He can't last forever," Emma finished. She watched her remaining students in the yard, playing their usual games with unusual, subdued energy. "How long until Jake arrives, assuming he rode out immediately?" 4 days, maybe 5. Bennett's hand found hers under the desk. "Can the town hold that long?" Before she could answer, the schoolhouse door banged open. Clay Mason himself stood. In the entrance, backlit by the afternoon sun, his eyes took in their clasped hands, the half-eaten lunch, the startled faces of children frozen in their play. "Well now," he drawled, "ain't this cozy? Mind if I sit in on today's lesson, Miss Hawkins? Always did want to further my education." Behind him, his brother Luke Mason slouched against the doorframe, cleaning his nails with a wicked-looking knife. The message was clear. This wasn't a request. Emma squeezed Bennett's hand once before letting go. "Children," she called, proud of how steady she kept her voice. "Time to come in. Today we'll be learning about moral courage and what it means to stand up for what's right." Mason's smile turned sharp as a blade. "Oh, yes," he said softly. "Let's talk about courage, Miss Hawkins. Let's talk about what happens to people who think they can defy the natural order of things." The children filed in silently, eyes down, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Whether they were bringing rain or her brother's justice, Emma couldn't say. She only knew that time was running out for Timber Creek. The Golden Nugget Saloon hummed with nervous energy as dusk painted Timber Creek's sky in shades of blood and gold. Clay Mason lounged at his usual table, watching Luke Mason pace between the bar and door like a caged mountain cat. "Would you settle yourself?" Clay snapped, the first signs of strain showing through his cultivated calm. "Your wandering's giving me a headache." "Something ain't right," Luke muttered, hand resting on his gun belt. "Telegraph office being closed for repairs right when we come to town. That old man Phillips claiming his equipment's broke." He spat into a brass spittoon. "Somebody sent for the law." At a corner table, 3 local cowhands hunched over their whiskies, voices carrying just loud enough to be heard tell Marshal Hawkins tracked the Carson gang through 3 feet of snow. "Found 'em in a cave up in the Bitterroots. A die brought back all 6, draped over their own horses." Clay's glass hit the table hard enough to slosh whiskey over the rim. The cowhands fell silent, but the damage was done. The name hung in the air like gunsmoke. Outside the saloon, Dr. Bennett paused in his evening rounds, close enough to hear the conversation through the batwing doors. His hand tightened on his medical bag as boots scraped on wooden floorboards. "Inside, Hawkins," Clay said, his voice carrying clearly now. "You boys seem mighty interested in that particular lawman." Just telling tales, Mr. Mason," one cowhand stammered. "No offense meant." "Tell me another," Clay commanded, his tone pleasant as a rattler's warning. "I do so enjoy a good story about the famous Marshal Hawkins." The cowhands exchanged terrified glances before the oldest spoke. They say he can track a man by the sound his conscience makes when he sleeps. Say he never stops once he's on your trail, like God's own judgment made flesh." Luke Mason's laugh held no humor. "Superstitious? Nonsense, he's just a man. Men bleed, men die." "True enough," Clay agreed, but his fingers drummed a nervous pattern on the table. "Still, might be time we thought about moving on. This town's getting uncomfortable." Dr. Bennett slipped away before he could hear more, hurrying toward the schoolhouse where lamplight still burned in the window. Emma sat at her desk, grading papers as if the town wasn't balanced on a knife's edge. "They're afraid," he reported without preamble. "The very name Hawkins has them spooked." Emma's pen paused over a student's arithmetic. "They should be," she said softly. "Jake's not like other lawmen. He doesn't know how to give up, how to look the other way. It's why I left. I couldn't bear to watch him transform himself into living justice." "Is it true what they say about his tracking abilities?" "The stories." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Most are exaggerated, but Jake, he understands evil men, understands how they think, how they run. It's like he can read the darkness in their souls." Bennett pulled up a child's chair, sitting awkwardly. "Emma, there's something I need to tell you about my past." A gunshot split the evening quiet. They rushed to the window to see Luke Mason standing over one of the cowhands, who clutched a bleeding arm. "Next man spreads tales about marshals," Luke shouted, his voice carrying down the street. "Gets it in the head instead of the arm." "I have to go," Bennett said, grabbing his bag. "That wound needs tending." He hesitated at the door. "Emma, when your brother arrives, remember that not everything is as simple as it seems." She watched him hurry toward the injured man, wondering at the weight of unspoken words in his voice. Around her, the town seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Somewhere out there, Jake was riding hard toward Timber Creek, and Emma prayed his arrival would bring justice without the rivers of blood that so often followed in his wake. In the gathering dark, she could hear Luke Mason's voice, tight with barely controlled fear. "You hear me? No more talk of Marshals, no more talk of Hawkins." But it was too late. The name was out there now, whispering on the wind, and even the mighty Mason gang couldn't stop what was coming. Emma stood before her small mirror in the boarding house, pinning her hair for the evening social. Though Mayor Whitaker had suggested cancelling the weekly gathering, she'd insisted they maintain some semblance of normalcy for the children's. Sack! Besides, she thought, straightening her best blue dress, surrendering their traditions meant the Mason gang had already won. A soft tap at her door revealed Dr. Bennett, hat in hand, looking uncommonly neat in a pressed suit. "Miss Hawkins," he said, then corrected himself. "Emma, you look lovely." The warmth in his eyes made her cheeks colour. Over the past months, she'd grown to appreciate more than just his medical skills. His gentleness with frightened children, his quiet strength, the way his hand found hers when she needed support most. "Thomas," she replied, testing the feel of his given name. A commotion from the street interrupted them. Luke Mason's voice rose harsh in the evening air. "Check. Every building. Clay wants that telegraph operator found." Emma's heart seized. Old Phillips had disappeared that morning after the Mason gang's interrogation, taking with him any evidence of messages sent. She prayed he'd made it safely to the next town. "We should cancel the social," Bennett said quietly. "It's not safe." "No." Emma's voice was firm. "These people need hope. They need to know fear hasn't won." She took his offered arm, adding softly, "And I need an evening of pretending we're just a doctor and a schoolmarm, courting properly." His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Emma, about what I've been trying to tell you." "There you are, Doc." Luke Mason's bulk filled the boarding house doorway. "Got a patient needs seeing to." His grin was ugly. "Seems old Philip's grandson took a fall. Bad one." Emma felt Bennett stiffen beside her. "Tommy Phillips is 8 years old," she said, ice in her voice. "Accidents happen," Luke drawled, "especially when folks don't cooperate." Bennett squeezed her arm once before releasing it. "My bag's at the office. I'll need to. Already got it here." Luke held up the doctor's familiar black bag. "Boss wants you where he can see you work." The threat was clear. Emma watched helplessly as they led Bennett away, his straight back and measured stride betraying no fear. But she'd seen the shadow cross his face, the same one she'd noticed that first day the gang arrived. The social went ahead as planned, though few attended. Emma moved among the townspeople, offering encouraging words, watching mothers hold their children closer when Mason's men swaggered past the church windows. She noted how Clay Mason himself stayed to observe, his calculating eyes following her movements. Near midnight, Bennett finally returned, his face grey with exhaustion and something darker. He found her by the punch bowl, speaking low. "Tommy will live, but Emma, this has to end." "Jake's coming," she whispered back. 2 more days at most. That may be too late." He glanced around before continuing. "There's something you should know about Clay Mason, about why he chose Timber Creek." He took a deep breath. "I used to... Doc." Clay Mason's voice cut through the quiet church. "Think the schoolmarms. Had enough of your attention tonight? Come share a drink with real men." Bennett's jaw tightened. "Tomorrow," he promised Emma. "After school. There's something I have to tell you." She watched him go, followed by Clay's mocking laughter. Through the window, thunder rumbled on the horizon, a storm approaching or perhaps something else. Her hand strayed to her pocket where Jake's telegraph response crackled. "Hold firm, stop riding hard, stop." 2 days. The town had to hold together for 2 more days. But watching Tommy Phillips' mother weep quietly in a corner, seeing the bruises barely hidden by the boy's bandages, Emma wondered if they had that long. She was a Hawkins, after all. Perhaps it was time she stopped waiting for her brother's justice and found a way to deliver her own. In her mind, she could hear Jake's voice from long ago. Sometimes, little sister, doing right means getting your hands dirty. She'd argued then, believing in the power of education and civilization to overcome barbarism. Now, watching Clay Mason's men terrorize her town, while Bennett struggled with whatever secret burden he carried, she wasn't so sure. Tomorrow, she decided, tomorrow she would act, whether her heart was ready or not. Morning brought fire to Timber Creek. The general store's storage shed went up in flames just before dawn, a warning to those who hadn't paid the gang's protection money. Emma watched from her boarding house window as townspeople formed a bucket line, Mason's men lounging nearby, making no move to help. Clay Mason sat his horse in the middle of the street, overseeing the chaos like a king surveying his domain. When old Mrs. Peterson stumbled in the bucket line, slopping water on Luke, Mason's boots, the outlaw backhanded her hard enough to send her sprawling in the mud. "That's enough." Dr. Bennett's voice cut through the commotion. He helped Mrs. Peterson to her feet, squaring off against Luke. "These are decent people. There's no need for—" "Decent people pay their debts, Doc," Clay interrupted smoothly. "Speaking of debts, ain't it time you told them all why you're really here, or should I?" Emma, who had started toward the confrontation, saw Bennett go rigid. Around them, the townspeople paused in their firefighting, sensing something significant. "In the exchange." "Not now, Clay," Bennett said, his voice low and dangerous, a tone Emma had never heard from the gentle doctor before. Clay's laugh was cruel. "No? Then maybe it's time I sent a telegram to the federal marshal's office. Let them know where their missing undercover agent went to ground." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Emma felt her world tilt sideways as Bennett's strange behavior, his mysterious past, suddenly crystallized into horrible clarity. "Thomas?" she whispered, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. "Oh, yes," Clay continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Dr. Bennett here used to ride with a badge, infiltrated the Carson gang last year, got most of them hung. Would have done the same. To us. But someone warned us in time." His smile turned vicious. Someone close to him, someone who knew his real purpose. "That's enough, Clay." Bennett's hand had strayed toward his coat, where Emma knew he kept his derringer. "Tell them the best part, Doc," Luke joined in, circling behind Bennett. "Tell them about Jenny." The name seemed to strike Bennett like a physical blow. "She had nothing to do with your wife, wasn't she?" Clay's voice dripped false sympathy. "Such a tragedy. What happened to her after you abandoned her to chase us?" "If you'd just stayed away—" He shrugged. "Well, accidents happen to women alone on the frontier." Bennett moved faster than Emma would have believed possible. His derringer appeared as if by magic, aimed at Clay's heart. "You murderous!" The crack of a rifle cut him off. Bennett's gun went flying as a bullet struck his hand. He fell to one knee, clutching his bleeding fingers as Luke Mason emerged from behind a water trough, rifle smoking. "Now then," Clay said pleasantly, as if nothing had happened, "about that debt. Seems to me you owe us, Doc, for Jenny, for your failure to catch us, and we mean to collect." He raised his voice to address the crowd. "New law in Timber Creek. Any man, woman, or child needs medical attention, they pay us first. We'll decide if the good doctor sees them." Emma started forward, but Bennett's eyes finally met hers, pleading, "Stay back. Don't reveal yourself." She froze, torn between the urge to help and the knowledge that she was the town's last hope if her brother didn't arrive in time. "And just to make sure everyone understands the new order," Clay continued, "school's cancelled until further notice. Can't have the children learning any more dangerous ideas about standing up to authority." He smiled directly at Emma. "Though, perhaps Miss Hawkins would enjoy giving private lessons. My brother Luke's been wanting to further his education." The lewdness in his tone made Emma's skin crawl. She watched helplessly as two of Mason's men dragged Bennett toward the doctor's office, leaving a trail of blood in the dust. The townspeople slowly dispersed, eyes down, spirits broken. But as Emma turned to go, she caught a glimpse of something in Bennett's face. Not defeat, but calculation. Whatever his past, whatever secrets he carried, he wasn't finished fighting. Yet neither was she. Tonight, she decided. Tonight she would make her move, Marshal or no Marshal. The Mason gang had ruled through fear long enough. She didn't see Clay Mason watching her go, didn't see him turn to his brother with a quiet order. Search the doctor's office. Find everything you can about his communications with the Marshals. Office and Luke. Find out if he's been helping anyone send telegrams. It's time we reminded this town what happens to people who defy the natural order of things. The storage shed continued to burn behind them, its smoke staining the morning. Sky like an omen of darker things to come. Night had fallen by the time Emma slipped through the back door of the doctor's office, a basket of fresh bandages clutched in her hands. She found Bennett at his desk, awkwardly wrapping his injured hand by lamplight. The proud set of his shoulders had told her he'd been expecting her. "You should have told me," she said softly, setting down the basket and taking over the bandaging. His skin was fever-warm under her touch. Would it have made a difference? He winced as she pulled the bandage tight. Would you have trusted a failed lawman? A man who couldn't even protect his own wife? "I trusted the man who cared for this. Town's children who stood up to bullies." She tied off the bandage with gentle fingers. "That hasn't changed." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Hasn't it? Clay Mason destroyed everything I loved because I thought I could bring him to justice. And now," he gestured at his injured hand, "I can't even hold a scalpel steady." Emma's mind raced through possibilities. "But you can still teach someone else to help. Sarah Cooper's mother was a nurse during the war, and Tommy Murphy has steady hands. He could learn to assist." Bennett stared at her. "Emma, they'll kill anyone who helps me treat patients without their permission. Not if we're careful. Not if we work in secret." She leaned closer, voice dropping. "The old mining office behind the Chandler's shop. It's been empty for months. We could set up a hidden clinic there, create a network of lookouts. The children could carry messages. No one pays attention to playing children. It's too dangerous. If they catch you, more dangerous than letting them control who lives and dies in this town." She straightened, and for a moment Bennett saw something of her brother in her stance. "I've spent my life running from violence, trying to build a world of learning and civilization, but some men only understand force." A sound at the window made them both freeze. Emma doused the lamp while Bennett drew another derringer from his desk, his backup weapon. They waited in tense silence until a whispered voice came. "Doc, Miss Hawkins, it's Tommy Phillips." Emma opened the back door to admit the bandaged boy. His face was pale but determined in the moonlight. "Gangs searching houses," he reported. "Looking for proof about who's been sending telegrams. They're heading this way." Bennett cursed softly, pulling a leather satchel from beneath a floorboard. "My reports to the Marshal's office. Records of the gang's movements." He thrust the satchel at Emma. "Take them. Hide them somewhere they'll never look." "The schoolhouse," she decided. "Under the floorboards beneath my desk. They won't suspect." Boots clumped on the front porch. Luke Mason's voice carried through the door. "Open up, Doc. Time for a midnight." "House call! Go!" Bennett whispered urgently. "Both of you, through the back." Emma hesitated. "Thomas, I'll be fine. They need me alive to control the town." His good hand caught hers, squeezed once. "Emma, whatever happens, your brother isn't the only one who knows how to play a long game." She understood then. He'd been gathering evidence all along, building a case against the gang, even as he played the simple country doctor. Just as she'd hidden her own identity, he'd worn a mask of peaceful intentions while working toward justice. Emma and Tommy slipped into the night as the front door crashed open. They crouched in the shadows, watching Mason's men ransack the office, while Bennett stood calmly in their midst, empty hands raised. Only Emma saw the fury burning behind his controlled expression. Later, after hiding the satchel and seeing Tommy safely home, Emma sat at her desk in the darkened schoolhouse. On a fresh sheet of paper, she began to write, "Dear students, school may be closed, but learning never stops. Tomorrow, meet me at the old oak tree by the creek. Bring only yourselves and willing hearts. There are lessons that can't be taught in daylight and battles that can't be won with guns alone." In the street outside, Mason's men continued their searches. But in quiet homes throughout Timber Creek, children prepared for a different kind of education, one that would teach them how to resist tyranny from the shadows. And somewhere on the dark prairie, a lone rider pushed his horse harder, following an invisible trail toward the town that needed him. Jake Hawkins was coming. Emma just prayed her resistance could keep the town alive until he arrived. The old oak tree by the creek had stood witness to generations of Timber Creek's children at play. Now, in the grey light before dawn, it watched over a different kind of gathering. Emma counted heads as her students arrived in 2s and 3s. 12 brave souls who'd heeded her secret message. "Remember," she whispered as they huddled close, "you're playing a game called Messenger. If anyone asks, you're learning about the Pony Express." Sarah Cooper raised her hand, just as she would in class. "But we're really being spies, ain't we, Miss Hawkins?" "Are we?" Emma corrected automatically, then smiled. "And yes, in a way. Each of you has a route to watch. Tommy, you take Main Street. Mary, the backs of the stores. Sarah, watch the saloon, but from a safe distance." She assigned each child a section of town, showing them how to pass information using innocent-seeming signals. A hair ribbon untied meant danger approaching. A dropped handkerchief marked a message hidden in the hollow fence post behind the general store. As the sun rose, the children scattered like morning mist, their games indistinguishable from normal play to any watching eyes. But Emma saw how Tommy Murphy's marbles game gave him a clear view of the Mason gang's comings and goings, how Sarah Cooper's skipping rope routine carried her past every major building in town. By noon, she had her first intelligence. Clay Mason had ridden out with 2 men, leaving Luke to watch the town. Dr. Bennett was being kept under guard in his office, treating only those who could pay the gang's steep prices. And most importantly, a shipment of rifles was due to arrive for the Outlaws the next day. Emma kept her schoolmarm's routines, visiting the general store, exchanging pleasantries with townspeople. But each conversation carried hidden meaning. Lovely weather for hanging washing meant the coast was clear. "Looks like rain," warned of gang members nearby. "Might need medicine soon," identified those needing secret medical care. She found unexpected allies. Mrs. Peterson, still sporting bruises from Luke Mason's attack, offered her root cellar as a hiding place. Old Jake Murphy, his barn in ashes, volunteered his ranch hands as armed backup when the time came. The resistance grew, quiet as a prairie stream underground, while above ground the Mason gang's control tightened. Luke Mason took particular pleasure in enforcing his brother's rules, dealing out casual cruelty like playing cards. Emma was checking the hollow fence post when she heard the screams. Running toward the sound, she found Luke Mason standing over young Billy Watson, who'd been caught passing a message about the rifles. "Playing games, boy?" Luke's boot drew back for another kick. "Let's play a new one." "Stop!" Emma's voice cracked like a whip. "He's just a child." Luke turned, eyes glinting with malice. "Awful protective of these brats, ain't you, Miss Hawkins? Makes a man wonder what you're teaching them." She forced herself to stay calm, channeling the steel she'd seen so often in her brother. "Reading, writing basic sums. Though I'm happy to demonstrate, Mr. Mason. Perhaps you'd like to learn how to spell your name properly?" The mockery hit home. Luke's face darkened as titters came from watching townspeople. His hand dropped to his gun. "Maybe it's time someone taught you proper respect." "Luke!" Dr. Bennett's voice rang from his office doorway, where he stood flanked by guards. "That boy's father paid good money for treatment yesterday. Damage the merchandise, and Clay will want to know why you're cutting into profits." Luke spat in the dust, but stepped back. "Get him out of here," he growled to Billy's waiting friends. "Next time, boy, ain't no schoolmarm gonna save you." Emma helped Billy up, checking his injuries. Beyond bruises, she found something worse. A crumpled paper with details about the rifle shipment. "If Luke had found it tonight," she whispered to the boy. "Pass the word. Everyone meets at Murphy's ranch. It's time." As she watched her students disperse, Emma felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper on her shoulders. She was no longer just a teacher protecting her children. She was becoming a general, moving pieces on a deadly chessboard, and tomorrow would bring rifles to her enemies unless she found a way to stop them. The time for simple resistance was ending. Now they would have to strike back. In his office, Bennett watched her through the window, understanding dawning in his eyes. He'd seen that look before, on the faces of good people pushed too far. Timber Creek had made its choice. The only question was how much blood it would cost them all. The storm broke over Timber Creek just before midnight, turning the streets to mud and drumming against the roof of Murphy's barn, where Emma met with her conspirators. Lightning illuminated the grim faces of ranchers, shopkeepers, and mothers who'd lost too much to fear. "The rifles come at dawn," Emma said, her voice carrying over the thunder. "Clay Mason's men will meet the shipment at Devil's Fork, 3 miles north. From there, they'll bring them straight down Main Street, a show of force." Old Jake Murphy spat into the straw. "Let them come. My boys are ready." "No." Emma spread a rough map on a hay bale. "We stop them before they reach town, here at the narrow pass." Her finger traced the route. "The wagon will have to slow. That's where we take them." "With what weapons?" Mrs. Peterson asked. "They took most of our guns first day they came." A new voice spoke from the shadows. "Not all of them." Dr. Bennett limped into the lamplight, his bandaged hand cradled against his chest. Behind him, Tommy Phillips carried a heavy canvas bag. "Thomas!" Emma moved to support him. "How did you—" "Your students are clever smugglers." He managed a weak smile. "Luke's guards never suspected the children bringing me supplies were actually helping me escape." His expression turned serious. "I've been collecting these since I first came to town. Part of my former profession's preparation." Tommy upended the bag. Revolvers, rifles, and boxes of ammunition spilled onto the hay. "Not enough to arm everyone," Bennett cautioned. "But enough for an ambush if we're smart." Distant horses. Hooves pounded past the barn, making them all freeze. Through gaps in the walls, they watched Luke Mason ride by, checking the town's lockdown. But there was something else in his posture, tension, like a man expecting trouble. "They're nervous," Bennett observed. "Clay's been pushing the men harder, posting extra guards. They know something's coming." "Jake," Emma whispered, then louder. "My brother. They must have heard he's close." Murphy's eldest son spoke up. "Traders brought word. Marshal Hawkins was seen crossing the big river yesterday, riding hell for leather, they said. Then we moved tonight." Emma's voice hardened with decision. "Before those rifles arrive, before Clay Mason can fortify further," she turned to the assembled townspeople, "I won't force anyone. This is your choice." One by one, they stepped forward. Mothers who'd seen their children terrorized, farmers who'd lost crops and cattle to the gang's protection fees, shopkeepers whose livelihood bled away one demand at a time. "Good." Emma began assigning positions. "Murphy's boys, you'll take the high ground here. Mrs. Peterson, your cellar connects to the old mine tunnel. Can you get our shooters into position behind the bank?" As she spoke, Bennett watched her transform. Gone was the gentle schoolmarm who taught children their letters. In her place stood a tactician, a leader, every inch Jake Hawkins's sister, another. Bolt of lightning split the sky, and in its flash they saw a rider on the distant ridge. For a moment he seemed to pause, silhouetted against the storm clouds. Then he was gone, like a ghost on the wind. "Was that?" Tommy Phillips began. "No." Emma shook her head. Jake would never announce himself like that. That was one of Mason's. "Scouts!" She hefted a rifle, checking its action with practiced hands that made Bennett raise an eyebrow. "Which means we have less time than we thought. They'll run the rifles through early, trying to beat my brother here." "You've done this before," Bennett said softly, "behind your school books and lessons." She met his eyes. "I am who I was raised to be, much like you, Thomas." Thunder rumbled again, closer now. Or perhaps it was hoofbeats carrying justice toward Timber Creek like an approaching storm. Either way, blood would flow with the morning rain. Emma chambered around. "Take your positions. Tonight, we teach the Mason gang a lesson about underestimating a town of determined people." Her smile was fierce in the lamplight. "And their schoolmarm." They moved out into the storm, shadows among shadows, while behind them, Dr. Bennett whispered a prayer, though whether for their success or their souls, even he couldn't say. Dawn painted the sky blood-red over Devil's Fork, as Emma and her ambushers lay in wait. The storm had passed, leaving behind mud and mist that clung to the narrow pass like a shroud. Through the fog came the creak of wagon wheels, the rifle, shipment, running early just as she'd predicted, but something was wrong. The sound approached from the wrong direction. "It's a trap," Bennett's whisper carried urgent through the rocks. "They're coming from—" Gunfire erupted from above them. Clay Mason had anticipated their attack, positioned his men on both sides of the pass during the night. Emma heard Murphy's boys crying out as bullets found marks in the fog. "Fall back!" she shouted. "Back to town!" They retreated in chaos, taking fire from unseen positions. Emma's borrowed rifle barked twice, answered by cursing as at least one shot found its mark. But they were hopelessly outnumbered. Then a new sound cut through the gunfire, a long, piercing whistle that froze every hand and heart. Through the mist rode a tall figure on a dark horse, his marshal's badge catching the sunrise like a star. "Jake," Emma breathed. Marshal Jake Hawkins sat his horse with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, his face weathered by sun and violence. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, cold and hard as frozen steel. Clay Mason. His voice carried like thunder in the sudden silence. "You're a long way from Montana." Clay Mason emerged from the rocks above, rifle held casual but ready. "Hawkins. Should have known you'd come running when your sister called." His smile turned cruel. "Just like old times, eh? You, me, and a woman who needs protecting?" Emma saw, her brother's hand tighten on his reins. "Sarah was innocent," Jake said, each word dropping like a stone. "She wasn't part of our business." "Sarah?" Bennett whispered to Emma. "What's he?" "Your wife," Clay answered for him. "The Marshal's precious little sister-in-law, my brother Luke's woman, before Hawkins here decided to play lawman." The pieces fell into place in Emma's mind. Why Clay had chosen Timber Creek. Why he'd taken such pleasure in tormenting another town schoolteacher. This wasn't just about power or money. This was revenge. "You killed her," Jake stated flatly, "after I arrested Luke, after the judge sentenced him to hang." "Luke escaped that noose, Marshal, no thanks to you." Clay's voice dripped venom. "And Sarah, she chose wrong, chose law over love, had to show other women the price of such choices." His eyes found Emma. Still teaching that lesson today. Jake's coat cleared his holster so fast, Emma barely saw the movement. "Off your horses," he commanded Mason's men, "guns on the ground, or I paint these rocks with your boss's blood." Clay laughed. You always did think you were fastest, Hawkins, but I've got 30 men to your one. Even the great Marshal can't. The sound of multiple hammers cocking interrupted him. From the rocks emerged Murphy's boys, not retreating, but circling behind on Emma's signal. From the other side came Mrs. Peterson's group, armed with Bennett's smuggled weapons, and from the town rode a dozen more men, led by old Jake Murphy himself. Count again, Emma called up to Clay. While you watched the pass, we emptied the town of every able hand. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Clay Mason's eyes. He looked from Jake's steady gun to the armed townspeople, then back to his own men, who suddenly seemed fewer than before. "Last chance," Jake said quietly. "Surrender or die. But either way, you answer for Sarah." Clay's rifle snapped up. "Like hell, I—" 3 shots cracked as one. Jake's Colt, Emma's rifle, and Bennett's Derringer. Clay Mason toppled from the rocks, dead before he hit the ground. In the echoing silence, Luke Mason's voice screamed from somewhere in the fog. "Clay! You bastards killed Clay!" What happened next would burn itself into Timber Creek's memory forever. Fog swirled through Devil's Fork like smoke from Satan's own chimney as Luke Mason burst from cover, guns blazing in both hands. His face was twisted into a mask of grief and rage, all pretense of civilization stripped away. "You killed my brother." Each word was punctuated by a shot. "You killed him like you killed Jenny!" But it was Dr. Bennett who stepped forward, his injured hand still holding the smoking Derringer. "No, Luke, you killed Jenny, you and Clay." Luke's guns swung toward the doctor. "What are you talking about? She was my wife." "She was a federal agent," Bennett's voice carried clearly in the stunned silence. "My partner. We'd been tracking your gang for months when she got close to you. Too close." His good hand clenched. "She fell in love with the man she thought you were." Emma watched. Her brother's face changed as understanding dawned. "The Denver operation," Jake said softly. 2 years ago. That was your wife." Bennett nodded. When she discovered the truth about Luke's connection to the Mason gang, she tried to bring him in quietly, thought she could save him. His laugh was bitter. "Clay made sure that couldn't happen. Liar!" Luke's guns trembled. "She betrayed me, chose the law over love, just like Sarah did." "She chose justice," Bennett corrected. "And you chose to let your brother kill her for it." Emma stepped forward, her rifle still trained on Luke. "That's why you really came to Timber Creek, isn't it, Thomas? Not just to gather evidence. You knew they'd eventually come here." "I've been following them for 2 years." Bennett admitted, "feeding information to the Marshal's office, waiting for them to make a mistake. When I heard about a schoolteacher named Hawkins," he met her eyes, "I knew they wouldn't be able to resist." "You used my sister as bait." Jake's voice held dangerous quiet. "No," Emma interrupted. "He protected me, warned me, and when the time came, he armed us to protect ourselves." She smiled grimly. "Though I suspect he didn't know I'd been preparing for something like this my whole life." Luke's laugh held an edge of madness. "The proper little schoolmarm should have known any kin of Hawkins would be just as much a killer." "Not a killer," Emma corrected. "A teacher. And here's today's lesson. Even the smallest town can stand against tyranny if its people stand together." As if to prove her point, the armed townspeople tightened their circle. Murphy's boys on the ridges, Mrs. Peterson's group blocking the pass, old Jake Murphy himself leading the reinforcements from town. Luke Mason saw it too, the last of his. Men were surrendering, dropping weapons, raising hands. He was alone. "It's over, Luke," Bennett said quietly. "Jenny would want you to face justice properly." For a moment it seemed Luke might surrender. His guns lowered slightly. Then, with a roar of rage, he swung both revolvers toward Emma. "Die like your kind should." 3 shots rang out as one. Jake's Colt, Bennett's Derringer, and Emma's rifle. Luke Mason spun like a badly handled puppet, guns firing harmlessly into the air as he fell. In the end, it was Bennett who reached him first. Luke Mason looked up at the doctor with dying eyes. "Jenny," he whispered, did she really love me?" Bennett's voice was gentle. "Yes, the man she thought you were." Luke Mason died then, his last breath carrying something that might have been regret. As the townspeople began securing the remaining gang members, Emma found herself between her brother and Bennett. Jake studied the doctor with unreadable eyes. "You used my sister to catch them," he said finally. "No," Bennett replied steadily. "I came here tracking killers and found something worth protecting, worth fighting for." His eyes met Emma's. "Worth loving, if she'll have a broken-down lawman trying to make things right." Jake's hand moved to his gun, then stopped as Emma stepped between them. "I'm not Sarah," she said firmly, "or Jenny. I'm Emma Hawkins, and I choose my own path." She took Bennett's good hand in hers. "Including who I love." Jake looked between them for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Timber Creek," he said thoughtfully, "seems to have all the lore it needs." The victory at Devil's Fork wasn't the end. By mid-morning, word reached Timber Creek that the remaining Mason Gang members, those who'd stayed behind to guard the town, had barricaded themselves in the schoolhouse. They held 3 children hostage: Tommy Phillips, Sarah Cooper, and little Mary Watson. "They're demanding safe passage," Jake reported grimly to the War Council gathered in Murphy's barn. "And $10,000 in gold." Emma's hands tightened on her rifle. "Those are my students. They're hoping we'll be desperate enough to let them ride out," Bennett added, his medical bag open as he tended wounds from the earlier fight. "Using children as shields. They know we won't risk shooting. Then we don't shoot." Emma spread out a rough diagram of the schoolhouse on a hay bale. "I know every board, every nail of that building. There's another way." The assembled townspeople leaned in as she outlined her plan. It was audacious, dangerous, and their only hope of saving the children. "The cellar trapdoor," she explained, pointing. "Behind my desk. They won't know about it. I kept it hidden, under the rug. The old shelter from Indian raids," old Jake Murphy nodded, "connects to tunnels running under half the town." "Exactly." Emma's finger traced lines on the diagram. "While Marshal Hawkins keeps their attention at the front, Mrs. Peterson will lead a group through the tunnels. We'll come up right under them. They'll still have guns on the children," Bennett warned. "Not if they can't see." Emma pulled out a small package wrapped in oilcloth. "Smoke bombs. I've been making them since the gang arrived. Saltpeter and sugar from the general store mixed with my own recipe." At their startled looks, she added, "I grew up with a lawman brother. I learned more than just reading and writing." Jake's weathered face showed a hint of pride. "How long will the smoke last?" "Long enough. When it starts, the children know to drop and crawl to the corners. We've drilled it as a fire safety exercise." Bennett shook his head in amazement. "You've been preparing them all along." "A teacher's duty is to prepare her students for any possibility." Emma's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Even this." They spent an hour refining the plan. Murphy's boys would take positions on nearby roofs. Jake would lead the front negotiation. Bennett, despite his injured hand, insisted on joining Emma's tunnel group. He knew field medicine if things went wrong. As they made ready, Jake pulled his sister aside. "Emma, what you've done here, building this resistance, preparing these people. Sarah would have been proud." Emma touched the Marshal's badge on his chest. "We protect in different ways, brother. You with your gun, me with my lessons. But both serve justice in the end." By noon, they were in position. Emma crouched in the hot, close tunnel beneath her schoolhouse, listening to booted feet pace above. Bennett's good hand found hers in the darkness, squeezed once. Through the floorboards came a child's whimper, followed by a harsh voice. "Shut up, girl. Your precious teacher ain't coming to save you now." "Actually," Emma whispered, preparing to give the signal, "today's lesson is already in session." She lit the first smoke bomb's fuse, ready to teach the Mason gang's remnants their final lesson about underestimating a frontier schoolmarm and her determined town. Smoke billowed through the floorboards of Timber Creek's schoolhouse, thick and disorienting. Above, chaos erupted as the outlaws shouted in confusion. Emma counted under her breath, waiting for the signal they'd arranged. "Fire!" came Sarah Cooper's high, clear voice, the code word she'd been taught. "Fire in the schoolhouse!" The sound of children dropping to the floor followed, just as they'd practiced. Emma nodded to Mrs. Peterson, who swung the trapdoor up with surprising strength for a woman her age. Smoke poured down into the tunnel, but they were ready, with wet cloths over their faces. Jake's voice boomed from outside. "Mason gang, you've got one chance to surrender. Come out with your hands up." The answering gunfire was wild, panicked. Emma emerged from the trapdoor into her classroom, now a hazy battleground. Through the smoke she made out shapes, her students crawling exactly where they should be, the outlaws stumbling blind near the windows. "The devil, are they?" One gang member coughed. "Can't see a blessed thing." "Watch the doors." Another shouted, "Don't let them, kids." Bennett's derringer barked twice from the tunnel entrance, followed by Mrs. Peterson's ancient but accurate rifle. Two shadows fell among the desks. Emma moved silent as a ghost through her classroom, years of knowing every creaky board now paying off. There, Tommy Phillips, exactly where he should be in the front corner. She touched his shoulder and felt him relax at her familiar grip. A bullet splintered the blackboard near her head. One of the outlaws was firing blind, spraying lead in. Desperation. "Come on then," he screamed. "Face us like men." "First lesson," Emma called, her voice seeming to come from everywhere in the smoke-filled room. "Assumptions can be deadly." More townspeople emerged from the tunnel as Jake kept the gang's attention divided with calls for surrender. Emma heard Sarah Cooper's soft whimper and moved toward it, finding the girl exactly where she'd been told to hide, but Mary Watson was missing from her assigned corner. A rough voice came through the smoke. "Got one!" "Don't nobody move or the girl gets it." Emma's heart froze. Through a gap in the smoke, she saw the biggest of the outlaws holding Mary Watson up as a shield, his gun pressed to her temple. The girl's eyes were wide with terror, but she managed to raise two fingers at her side, the signal for behind. Emma understood instantly. The brute was standing in front of her desk, not knowing about the trap door just behind his boots. "Marshal!" the outlaw shouted. "We're coming out. Try anything. She dies first." "Actually," came Bennett's calm voice from somewhere in the smoke, "first you might want to learn about leverage." The trapdoor opened beneath the outlaw's feet. He fell with a startled cry, his grip on Mary loosening just enough. The girl twisted free exactly as she'd been taught, dropping and rolling under a desk. Emma's rifle cracked once. The outlaw didn't. "Get up! Second lesson," she announced to the remaining gang members. "Education is power." The smoke was thinning now. Through it, the outlaws could finally see their situation, surrounded by armed townspeople emerging from the tunnel, covered by Murphy's boys through the windows, and with Marshal Hawkins blocking any escape through the door. "Third lesson," Emma continued, her rifle rock steady. "Communities stand together." One by one, the remaining Mason gang members dropped their weapons. As Jake and the townspeople moved in to secure them, Emma did a final count of her students. All safe, all exactly where they'd been taught to go. Bennett appeared at her side, his good hand steady on his derringer. "Quite a lesson plan, Miss Hawkins." "The day's not over yet," she replied grimly. "Look." Through the doorway, they could see the rifle wagon approaching from the north, driven by the gang members who'd missed the ambush at Devil's Fork. They were about to have company. "Fourth lesson coming up," Emma announced, checking her rifle's load. "Sometimes the hardest tests come at the end of class." Thunder rumbled in the distance as Timber Creek prepared for its final examination. The rifle wagon thundered down Timber Creek's main street, its drivers unaware they were rolling into a trap. Emma watched from the schoolhouse window as Jake positioned their forces with hand signals. Murphy's boys on the rooftops, Mrs. Peterson's, a group behind water troughs and barrels, Bennett directing the townspeople to cover from the doctor's office. "Remember," Jake called softly to his impromptu army, "we want them alive if possible. These men have appointments with a federal judge." Emma's students were safely locked in the church basement with armed parents standing guard. Now the schoolmarm stood ready with her rifle, wondering if her brother noticed how naturally she'd taken to this role, or if he'd always known this. Steel lay beneath her educator's exterior. The wagon reached the center of town before its drivers noticed something was wrong. The street was too quiet. The previously cowed townspeople were nowhere to be seen, and in the middle of the road stood Marshal Jake Hawkins, his badge catching the late afternoon sun. "That's far enough," Jake's voice carried clear and cold. "Throw down your weapons and step away from the wagon." The lead driver's response was predictable. He went for his gun. Jake's Colt barked once, sending the man's weapons spinning away, along with most of his trigger finger. All hell broke loose. The remaining gang members dove for cover behind the wagon, using the rifles in the back to lay down withering fire. But they'd played into Emma's hands. The wagon was now exactly where she wanted it. "Now!" she shouted. Tommy Phillips, who'd insisted on helping despite his mother's protests, yanked a hidden rope. A carefully constructed barricade of barrels tumbled from the livery stable's hayloft, rolling down the street toward the wagon. The outlaws were forced to scatter or be crushed. That's when Bennett's group opened fire from the doctor's office, picking off gang members as they abandoned their cover. Murphy's boys on the rooftops kept anyone from escaping down side streets. Emma herself took careful aim at the wagon's horses, shooting their harnesses. The frightened animals bolted, taking the wagon with them until it crashed into the water. A trough, spilling rifles across the muddy street. "Surrender!" Jake called again. "You're outflanked and outgunned!" Most of the remaining outlaws seemed ready to give up, but 3 made a desperate break for the schoolhouse, perhaps hoping to take hostages again. They didn't know Emma had prepared for this too. As they reached the schoolhouse steps, the ground gave way beneath them. The carefully weakened porch, its supports cut almost through during the previous hostage crisis, collapsed into a pit lined with Mrs. Peterson's rose bushes. Emma almost felt sorry for them as they landed among the thorns. "Your brother's not the only one who knows about setting traps," she told the closest outlaw as she covered him with her rifle. The last gang member standing was the wagon's second driver, a hulking brute named Jones, who'd earned a reputation for unnecessary cruelty. He stood in the street, a rifle in each hand, looking wildly for escape. "Give it up, Jones," Bennett called, limping forward with his derringer raised. "It's over." "Nothing's over." Jones raised both rifles. "I ain't hanging. I'll take half this." "Town with me first!" He opened fire, spraying bullets in every direction. Bennett dove for cover, his injured hand striking the ground hard enough to draw a cry of pain. Emma's rifle shot went wide as she was forced to duck behind a water barrel. That's when they heard it, a child's voice from the church. "Miss Hawkins, look out!" Little Mary Watson had somehow slipped away from the basement. She stood in the church doorway, pointing urgently. Emma turned to see Jones drawing a bead on her with his second rifle. Time seemed to slow. Emma knew she couldn't bring her rifle around fast enough. Jones's finger tightened on the trigger. 3 shots cracked as one, Jake's Colt, Bennett's Derringer, and a third from an unexpected source. Tommy Phillips stood in the livery stable door, holding one of the fallen gang's revolvers in hands that didn't shake. Jones toppled face first into the mud, his unfired rifle clattering away. Silence fell over Timber Creek's main street, broken only by the settling creak of the wrecked wagon and the distant roll of thunder. The last battle was over. Jake moved efficiently, securing prisoners with help from Murphy's boys. Bennett checked the wounded, directing townspeople to assist. And Emma gathered Tommy Phillips and Mary Watson close, checking them for injuries while delivering a stern lecture about following safety instructions. But her heart wasn't really in the scolding. They had all grown beyond simple classroom rules today. As the sun set behind the buildings, painting the street gold, she looked at her town with new eyes. Shopkeepers and farmers bound prisoners with grim satisfaction. Mothers emerged from hiding places, rifles still held competently in their hands. Children helped collect scattered weapons under the watchful eyes of armed parents. They had all learned lessons today, teacher and students alike. Lessons about courage, community, and the price of freedom. Lessons written not in chalk but in gunpowder and blood. And looking at Thomas Bennett across the street, she knew the hardest lesson was yet to come, learning to build something new from the ashes of the old. 2 weeks after the Mason gang's defeat, Emma stood before her restored classroom, watching morning sunlight stream through the new window panes. The bullet holes had been patched, the floors scrubbed clean, and her students' artwork once again brightened the walls. But something fundamental had changed in Timber Creek's little schoolhouse. Perhaps it was the way her students carried themselves now. Backs a little straighter, eyes a little sharper. They had learned things no teacher would wish upon children, but they had also discovered their own strength. "Time for class," she called, ringing the brass bell that had survived all the fighting. They filed in differently too. Tommy Phillips, his father's spare revolver now officially his own, hung his gun belt by the door with quiet pride. Sarah Cooper and Mary Watson sat together, their friendship forged stronger by shared danger. Even little Billy Watson walked taller, despite his healing bruises. "Today," Emma announced, picking up her chalk, "we return to our regular lessons. But first," the schoolhouse door opened, admitting Marshal Jake Hawkins. Her brother's presence still commanded attention, but the children no longer showed fear, only respect. "Apologies for interrupting, Miss Hawkins," he said formally. "But I've news the town should hear." Emma nodded. "Children, let's move to the town hall." They walked together through Timber Creek's changing streets. The damage from the fighting was mostly repaired now, but other changes were more permanent. Gun belts hung openly on shopkeepers' hips. Women moved with new confidence, many having discovered they could shoot as straight as any man. And everywhere, people nodded respectfully to the schoolmarm who had helped lead their resistance. The town hall filled quickly. Dr. Bennett arrived. Last, his bandaged hand healing well, taking his place beside Emma with quiet certainty. They had not spoken of marriage yet, but the whole town knew it was only a matter of time. Jake stood before them, his marshal's badge gleaming. "Word from the territorial governor," he announced. "In recognition of recent events, Timber Creek has been granted its own sheriff's office. A proper jail will be built, and a deputy assigned." He paused, looking at Bennett. "Dr. Thomas Bennett has been offered the position." A murmur ran through the crowd. Bennett's hand found Emma's, squeezed gently. "Furthermore," Jake continued, "the school board has approved Miss Hawkins' request. Timber Creek will have a proper schoolhouse built by spring, with room for twice the students." Emma felt tears threaten. She had fought so hard for that expansion, never expecting approval so soon. "And finally," Jake's voice softened, "I've been asked to make this town my permanent headquarters. It seems the governor feels Timber Creek has proven itself a worthy base for territorial law enforcement." The crowd erupted in cheers. Emma felt her heart swell. Her brother would stay, helping build the civilization she had always dreamed of. Later, as the sun set behind the prairie horizon, Emma sat at her desk preparing lessons. Bennett, soon-to-be Sheriff Bennett, leaned in her doorway, his good hand holding a small box. "I've been carrying this since before the gang arrived," he said quietly, waiting for the right moment. The ring was simple silver, but its meaning was pure gold. Emma's yes was interrupted by Jake's arrival. "Don't mind me," her brother said, the ghost of a smile touching his weathered face. "Just checking the schoolhouse's security, though I suspect my sister's students could defend it themselves now." "They've learned more than reading and writing," Emma agreed. "And their teacher?" Jake asked softly. "What has she learned?" Emma looked at her brother. the lawman who had shaped her childhood, whose shadow she had tried to escape, only to find her own version of his strength when it mattered most. "I've learned that justice wears many faces," she said. "Sometimes it carries a badge, sometimes it carries chalk, but it always requires courage, and it's always worth fighting for." Bennett's arm slipped around her waist as Jake nodded approval. Outside, Timber Creek settled into evening routine. Children played in the street, watched over by armed parents. The new deputy, young Tommy Phillips' father, made his first patrol, and in the schoolhouse, a teacher's lessons remained. On the blackboard, education is light, justice is truth, courage is love in action. Emma Hawkins had finally found her true calling, not running from her brother's legacy, but building her own. In Timber Creek, she would help forge a future where law and learning walked hand in hand, where children grew up strong and fair, and where even a schoolmarm could become a legend in her own right. The end.